The taste of recycled air and the metallic tang of fear still haunts me from when I first stepped aboard the bridge of an Imperial Star Destroyer. My name is Captain Thane Kyrell, former Imperial Navy officer turned chronicler of galactic empires. I witnessed the fall of one empire and the grinding persistence of another across 30 millennia. You think that makes me a traitor to the Emperor's memory, but you do not know what I've seen in the deepest archives of both the Death Star and the Golden Throne. I've walked the corridors where Vader's breathing echoed like a death knell, and I've stood in the shadow of the God Emperor's decaying form. I've seen how both empires treat their citizens as expendable resources, how both crushed worlds beneath their boots in the name of order. But here's what the histories won't tell you. Only one of these empires was built to last forever, and it wasn't the one you'd expect. The real horror isn't which empire was more powerful, it's which one understood the true price of eternity. This is my testimony, written in the blood of a billion worlds. Chapter 1. The Imperial Assessment. The first time I saw an Imperial Star Destroyer's bridge, I thought I was looking at the future of galactic governance. Clean lines, efficient systems, and the kind of technological superiority that could pacify 1,000 worlds with a single demonstration of force. The year was 2 BBY, and I was a young lieutenant fresh from the academy on Coruscant, convinced that the Empire represented order in a chaotic galaxy. Captain Veers stood beside me as we watched the hyperspace coordinates being calculated for our next deployment. "Beautiful, isn't she?" he said, gesturing to the viewport where stars streaked past in azure brilliance. 18 months to build, crew of 37,000, and enough firepower to glass a continent, the Emperor's vision made manifest. I nodded, still awed by the sheer scale of Imperial engineering. The Star Destroyer, Devastator, stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, its grey hull bristling with turbo-laser batteries and ion cannons. In the hangar bays below, squadrons of TIE fighters sat ready for launch, while stormtrooper battalions maintained perfect formation during their daily drills. Everything about the Empire spoke of precision, efficiency, and overwhelming technological superiority. But it was the speed of Imperial expansion that truly impressed me during those early years. In just 2 decades, the Empire had transformed from a crumbling republic into a galactic-spanning autocracy. The Clone Wars had ended with Palpatine as Masterstroke Order 66 and the systematic elimination of the Jedi Order. Within months, democratic institutions across the galaxy had been dissolved or absorbed into the Imperial machine. The numbers were staggering. 25,000 Star Destroyers patrolled Imperial space, supported by millions of smaller vessels. The Imperial Navy commanded over 2 million crewed ships, while the Imperial Army fielded countless legions across every inhabited world. On Coruscant alone, the Imperial bureaucracy employed over 100 million administrators, all working to catalogue, control, and exploit the resources of 1 million star systems. I remember studying the efficiency reports during my academy training. The Empire could mobilize entire battle fleets within hours, thanks to the HoloNet communication system that linked every corner of the galaxy. Trade routes were secured, piracy was virtually eliminated, and technological advancement proceeded at an unprecedented pace. The Death Star project represented the pinnacle of this achievement. A mobile battle station capable of destroying entire planets with a single blast. Order through strength was the Imperial motto, and it seemed to work. Rebellion was rare and quickly crushed. The Jedi were gone, their mystical powers no match for superior firepower and tactical coordination. Even species that had resisted Republic expansion for centuries found themselves unable to stand against Imperial might. During my service aboard the Devastator, I witnessed firsthand how Imperial doctrine functioned in practice. We would arrive in a system showing the first signs of sedition, and within hours, local resistance would crumble. The sight of a Star Destroyer dropping out of hyperspace was usually enough to secure immediate compliance. When it wasn't, a single demonstration of orbital bombardment typically sufficed. The Empire's greatest strength lay in its technological infrastructure. Hyperdrive technology allowed for rapid deployment across vast distances, while advanced manufacturing capabilities meant that losses could be quickly replaced. The Imperial Academy system produced a steady stream of competent officers, while clone trooper technology had been refined to create the Stormtrooper Corps. Soldiers who were uniformly trained, equipped, and motivated. But it was the centralized command structure that truly set the Empire apart. Unlike the chaotic democracy of the Old Republic, where Senate debates could delay military action for months, Imperial decisions flowed directly from the Emperor's will. A single word from Palpatine could mobilize entire sector fleets or authorize the construction of new superweapons. This efficiency was breathtaking to behold and terrifying to contemplate. I spent 3 years serving aboard various Imperial vessels, from the massive Executor-class dreadnoughts to the nimble Victory-class destroyers. Each ship was a marvel of engineering, equipped with the finest technology the galaxy could produce. The crew quarters were comfortable, the mess halls served real food instead of ration packs, and the medical facilities could treat injuries that would have been fatal just a generation earlier. The stormtroopers I served alongside were professionals in every sense of the word. Their armor was environmentally sealed and equipped with advanced targeting systems. Their weapons were precise and powerful, capable of punching through most defensive materials. Their training was comprehensive, covering everything from small unit tactics to urban warfare. Most importantly, their loyalty was absolute, not to any individual commander, but to the Empire itself. It was during the Battle of Scarif that I first began to question the Empire's longevity. We received reports that rebel forces had somehow infiltrated the Imperial data vault and stolen the Death Star plans. The operation was precise, professional, and ultimately successful, despite overwhelming Imperial defenses. As I watched the tactical displays showing rebel ships escaping into hyperspace, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in the galactic balance of power. The rebels weren't using superior technology or larger fleets. They were using the Empire's own strengths against it, exploiting the rigid command structure, turning Imperial efficiency into predictable patterns, and most importantly, inspiring ordinary citizens to risk everything for a chance at freedom. The Death Star itself, that ultimate symbol of Imperial power, had become a symbol of Imperial tyranny. But even then, I couldn't imagine the Empire actually falling. The industrial capacity was too vast, the military too powerful, the bureaucracy too entrenched. Palpatine had built something that seemed designed to last forever, a galactic order that could weather any storm and emerge stronger than before. How wrong I was. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. The first crack in my faith in Imperial permanence came not from any rebel victory, but from a routine inspection of a mining facility on Kessel. It was 6 months after Scarif, and the Empire was still reeling from the destruction of the Death Star. Lord Vader himself had arrived to oversee security improvements at critical infrastructure sites, and I was assigned to his inspection team as a technical advisor. The spice mines of Kessel had been operating for centuries, but under Imperial management, they had become a model of efficiency. Thousands of prisoners worked the dangerous tunnels while automated systems extracted and processed the valuable spice. The facility generated enormous profits for the Empire while serving as a deterrent to criminal activity. A perfect example of Imperial pragmatism. But as we descended into the lower levels, I began to notice troubling signs. The prisoner mortality rate had increased by 300% in the past year, not from accidents or rebellion, but from simple exhaustion. The automated systems were breaking down faster than they could be repaired, and replacement parts were becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. Most disturbing of all, the spice itself was showing signs of contamination that suggested the mining techniques were damaging the source veins. Lord Vader, I ventured during our return to the surface, the sustainability metrics for this facility are concerning. At current extraction rates, the spice deposits will be exhausted within 5 years, and the equipment failures suggest. The Dark Lord's breathing apparatus hissed as he turned to face me. You question Imperial methods, Captain. Not the methods, my lord, but the long-term viability. The Empire operates thousands of facilities like this across the galaxy. if they're all experiencing similar degradation? The Empire's resources are infinite, Vader interrupted, his mechanical voice carrying a note of finality. What is extracted here will be replaced elsewhere. What breaks will be rebuilt. The Emperor's vision encompasses far more than the lifespan of any single facility. But I had seen the production reports. I knew that replacement wasn't keeping pace with consumption, that the Empire's vast industrial machine was beginning to strain under its own weight. The Death Star project alone had consumed resources equivalent to the GDP of entire sector groups. The construction of a second Death Star was already underway, despite the clear evidence that such superweapons created more problems than they solved. It was during the evacuation of Hoth that I witnessed the Empire's tactical brilliance and strategic blindness in perfect balance. Admiral Ozzel's premature exit from hyperspace alerted the rebels to our presence, but Vader's immediate correction and the subsequent ground assault demonstrated Imperial adaptability under pressure. Our AT-AT walkers crushed the rebel defensive positions with mechanical precision, while our Star Destroyers prevented any escape through the system's outer reaches. Yet somehow, the principal rebel leadership escaped. Princess Leia, Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, all of them slipped through our fingers despite being trapped on a frozen world with limited escape routes. The rebels hadn't won through superior technology or better tactics. They had won because they understood something the Empire had forgotten, that desperate people with nothing to lose could accomplish impossible things. The Battle of Endor would later prove this point definitively, but even in the aftermath of Hoth, I could see the pattern emerging. The Empire's victories were tactical. We could win any single engagement, destroy any specific target, crush any organized resistance. But our strategic position was actually deteriorating with each success. Every world we pacified bred new rebels. Every demonstration of power created new martyrs. Every efficient solution generated new problems. I began to study the Empire's administrative structure more carefully during my off-duty hours. What I discovered was deeply troubling. The Emperor's policies were creating a system that could function brilliantly in the short term, but was inherently unstable over longer periods. The reliance on fear as a primary motivational tool meant that local administrators lived in constant terror of making mistakes. This led to systematic underreporting of problems and over-reporting of successes. The economic model was even more concerning. The Empire extracted wealth from member worlds, but provided little in return, except security from threats that the Empire itself had often created. Trade was heavily regulated to benefit core worlds at the expense of the Rim territories. Technological development was focused almost exclusively on military applications, while infrastructure improvements served primarily to facilitate resource extraction and troop movement. Most fundamentally, the Empire had no succession plan. Emperor Palpatine appeared to be in excellent health despite his advanced age, but he was still a mortal being governing a galactic civilization. Vader was his designated heir, but the Dark Lord's mechanical life support systems raised questions about his own longevity. Below them, the Imperial hierarchy was riddled with ambitious officers who would undoubtedly struggle for power if anything happened to either leader. The rebels exploited these structural weaknesses with increasing sophistication. Their intelligence networks fed on disaffected Imperial personnel who had witnessed the system's failures firsthand. Their military tactics focused on mobility and morale rather than direct confrontation. Most importantly, their political message offered a genuine alternative to Imperial rule. Not just different policies, but a completely different vision of how galactic civilization should function. I was present at the strategy conference where Admiral Piet first proposed the trap that would become the Battle of Endor. The plan was tactically sound. Use the second Death Star as bait to draw the rebel fleet into a decisive engagement, while ground forces eliminated the shield generator protecting the battle station. With the rebel leadership eliminated and their fleet destroyed, organized resistance would collapse within months. But even as I listened to the briefing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were fighting the wrong war. The rebels weren't just a military threat. They represented an ideological challenge to the Empire's fundamental assumptions. Destroying their fleet would eliminate the immediate threat, but it wouldn't address the underlying conditions that had created the rebellion in the first place. If anything, such a devastating victory might accelerate the Empire's internal decay by removing the external pressure that kept it focused and unified. The Emperor himself seemed to understand this on some level. His frequent references to the dark side of the Force and the power of hatred suggested that he viewed conflict as essential to maintaining Imperial strength. But this created a paradox. The Empire needed enemies to function effectively, but defeating those enemies would undermine the system's long-term stability. I remember watching the holographic displays during the Battle of Endor, seeing our perfectly coordinated battle plan unravel in real time. The Ewoks on the forest moon weren't supposed to be a factor. Primitive creatures, armed with Stone Age weapons, shouldn't have been able to threaten Imperial stormtroopers. The Rebel fleet wasn't supposed to survive long enough to discover that the Death Star's super laser was operational. The Emperor himself wasn't supposed to be vulnerable to a moment of familial sentiment from his apprentice. But all of these impossible events occurred because the Empire had become too rigid, too predictable, too dependent on technological solutions to fundamentally human problems. We had built a machine of galactic conquest that could defeat any military force in the galaxy, but we had forgotten that empires ultimately rise and fall based on the loyalty of their citizens, not the power of their weapons. As the second Death Star exploded and the Emperor's fleet scattered in defeat, I realized that the Empire's greatest weakness wasn't military or economic, it was philosophical. We had created a system based on the assumption that power could be maintained through fear and force alone, but we had ignored the reality that such systems inevitably generate their own opposition. The Empire would survive Endor, at least for a while. But I knew that we had just witnessed the beginning of the end, not because our enemies were stronger, but because our foundation was weaker than we had ever imagined. Chapter 3: The Imperium Awakens. 38,000 years later, I found myself standing in the shadow of the Golden Throne, and the comparison to my Imperial service was both immediate and unsettling. The throne room of the Emperor of Mankind stretched for kilometers in every direction, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows that seemed to devour light itself. The air reeked of incense, ozone, and something else, something that made my skin crawl with an instinctive recognition of wrongness. But it was the figure on the throne itself that truly drove home the difference between these two galactic empires. Where Palpatine had been a vital, commanding presence radiating dark power, the Emperor of Mankind was a corpse kept animate by machinery and will alone. His desiccated form was barely visible beneath layers of life support equipment, tubes and cables snaking across his skeletal frame like technological parasites. Yet the psychic pressure emanating from that decaying shell was so intense that even standing at the prescribed distance made my teeth ache. Beside me, Inquisitor Cassandra Vex whispered a litany of protection against the warp, her voice barely audible above the constant hum of the throne's machinery. 10,000 years, she said, her augmetic eye focusing on some detail I couldn't perceive. 10,000 years since the heresy, 10,000 years since he last walked among us, and still he protects humanity from the darkness between the stars. I had been brought to Terra as part of a historical research project. My unique perspective as a survivor from the old empire deemed valuable by the Ordo Malleus. The Inquisition wanted to understand how previous galactic civilizations had failed, hoping to identify weaknesses that might threaten the Imperium of Man. What I found instead was an empire that had learned from every mistake the Galactic Empire had made, and had paid a terrible price for that knowledge. The numbers alone were staggering in their scope. Where the Galactic Empire had controlled perhaps 1 million inhabited worlds, the Imperium claimed dominion over 1 million worlds simply within the segmentum solar. The total count of Imperial worlds numbered in the hundreds of millions, spread across a galaxy where humanity had seeded itself so thoroughly that extinction of the species was virtually impossible. But it was the age of the institution that truly set the Imperium apart. The Galactic Empire had lasted 24 years from its founding to its dissolution at Endor. The Imperium of Man had endured for over 10 millennia since the Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne, and its institutional memory stretched back even further to the Great Crusade and the Dark Age of technology. This was an empire that thought in geological timescales, where the rise and fall of entire civilizations were merely footnotes in the greater struggle for human survival. The Adeptus Mechanicus had shown me their historical archives during my orientation, vast data vaults containing fragments of humanity's greatest achievements and most terrible failures. The Men of Iron Rebellion, the Age of Strife, the birth of Slanesh. Each catastrophe had shaped imperial doctrine in fundamental ways. Where the Galactic Empire had been built on the assumption that technology could solve any problem, the Imperium treated technological innovation as a potential path to damnation. Your old empire fell because it trusted in machines, Magos Belisarius Cal had explained during one of our discussions, his mechanical appendages clicking in what I had learned to interpret as amusement. We understand that the machine is sacred, but only when it serves the Omnissiah's will. Your emperor sought to replace faith with efficiency. Our emperor becomes efficiency through faith. The theological foundation of the Imperium was unlike anything the Galactic Empire had attempted. Where Palpatine had demanded obedience based on fear and respect for authority, the Emperor of Mankind was worshipped as a literal god by trillions of human beings. The imperial cult wasn't just a political tool. It was a genuine religious movement that had spread across the galaxy through a combination of missionary zeal, institutional support, and demonstrated miracles. I had witnessed one such miracle during my visit to the shrine of Saint Celestine on Dimmermar. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, had been brought to the shrine dying of some wasting disease that had baffled the local medici. Her parents had traveled for months to reach the shrine, carrying her in their arms across battlefields and through warp storms. As they knelt before the statue of the living saint, the girl's fever broke, her strength returned, and her wounds began to heal before my eyes. Faith, the shrine's keeper had said simply when I asked for an explanation. The Emperor protects those who believe in his light. But the true genius of the imperial system wasn't its religious foundation. It was the way that faith had been weaponized and systematized. The Adeptus Ministorum wasn't just a church, it was a galaxy-spanning bureaucracy dedicated to maintaining ideological purity. The Space Marine chapters weren't just elite military units. They were quasi-religious orders whose entire existence was devoted to the Emperor's worship. The Imperial Guard wasn't just an army. It was a crusading force that fought as much for salvation as for territory. Most importantly, the Imperium had solved the succession crisis that had destroyed the Galactic Empire. The Emperor might be trapped upon the Golden Throne, but his will was interpreted and enacted by a complex hierarchy of institutions that had been refined over 10 millennia of practice. The High Lords of Terra might squabble over policy details, but they were united in their devotion to the Emperor's vision. The Primarchs might have been lost or corrupted, but the Space Marine chapters carried on their legacy according to strict codices and traditions. I spent weeks studying the Imperium's military organization, and the comparisons to my old service were both illuminating and disturbing. Where the Imperial Navy had relied on technological superiority and coordination, the Imperial Navy fought with weapons blessed by priests and powered by the faith of their crews. Where stormtroopers had been trained for efficiency and obedience, Imperial Guardsmen were indoctrinated with fanatical devotion to the Emperor's cause. The difference in scale was almost incomprehensible. A single Imperial Guard regiment could number in the millions, and there were thousands of such regiments scattered across the galaxy. The Imperial Navy fielded battleships that dwarfed Star Destroyers, vessels so massive that entire cities could fit within their hulls. But it was the Space Marines that truly demonstrated the Imperium's commitment to excellence through suffering. I watched a squad of Ultramarines conduct training exercises in the depths of Macrage's Fortress Monastery, and the experience was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. These weren't just elite soldiers, they were posthuman warriors who had literally died and been reborn in the Emperor's service. Their power armor was a masterwork of both technology and faith, every bolt and rivet consecrated according to ancient rituals. Their weapons carried the accumulated prayers of generations of battle brothers, each shot fired in the certainty that the Emperor guided its path. But perhaps the most striking difference between the two empires was their attitude toward loss and sacrifice. The Galactic Empire had treated setbacks as temporary obstacles to be overcome through superior planning and execution. The Imperium treated suffering as a necessary component of existence, a price that had to be paid to keep humanity alive in a hostile universe. The Departamento Munitorum archives contained casualty reports that would have broken the spirit of any Imperial commander. Entire worlds were routinely sacrificed to deny them to enemy forces. Millions of Imperial guardsmen died in battles that were fought not to achieve victory, but simply to buy time for evacuation or reinforcement. The Imperium calculated acceptable losses in terms of billions, not thousands. Yet somehow, this philosophy of acceptable sacrifice had created an empire more durable than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Imperium had survived the Horus Heresy, which had split humanity in half and nearly destroyed Terra itself. It had weathered the beast's the largest orc invasion in recorded history. It had endured 13 Black Crusades led by Chaos Space Marines, who knew all of its weaknesses and many of its secrets. Most tellingly, the Imperium had not just survived these threats, it had grown stronger through resistance to them. Each crisis had refined Imperial doctrine, eliminated weak elements, and strengthened the bonds between different Imperial institutions. Where the Galactic Empire had been undermined by its own successes, the Imperium seemed to thrive on adversity. During my final audience with Inquisitor Vex, she asked me for my professional assessment of Imperial stability compared to my previous service. I chose my words carefully, knowing that the wrong answer could result in charges of heresy or sedition. The Galactic Empire was built for conquest, I said. It was designed to expand rapidly, overwhelm resistance, and establish control through superior technology and organization. But it had no institutional memory, no long-term vision beyond the Emperor's personal ambitions, and no mechanism for adapting to fundamental changes in the strategic environment. "And the Imperium?" she prompted. "The Imperium was built for survival," I replied. "It assumes that the galaxy is hostile, that humanity's enemies are numerous and powerful, and that victory is achieved not through individual battles, but through outlasting all opposition. It may not be more efficient than the old empire, but it is infinitely more resilient." As I spoke those words, I realized that I was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history, an empire that had learned how to be eternal. The question was whether that eternity was worth the price humanity had paid to achieve it. Chapter 4. The Crucible of Eternity. The answer to that question came during the 13th Black Crusade, when I found myself aboard the battle barge Macragge's Honor as Abaddon the Despoiler's forces shattered the Cadian Gate and tore a wound across the galaxy itself. What I witnessed in those desperate months was the Imperium's greatest test since the Horus Heresy, and the clearest demonstration of why it would outlast any conceivable rival. The Great Rift erupted across the galaxy like a cosmic scream, splitting the Imperium in half and unleashing horrors that made the Empire's confrontation with the rebels seem like a minor skirmish. Demon armies poured through rifts in reality itself. Chaos Space Marines who had fought in the Heresy 10,000 years earlier returned to finish what they had started. Worlds that had stood loyal since the Great Crusade fell to corruption or were consumed by warp storms that defied all attempts at navigation. I stood on the bridge of the battle barge as Captain Sicarius coordinated the defense of the Ultramar sector, and I watched him make decisions that would have been unthinkable to any Imperial Navy commander. When the Forge world of Konor came under attack by word-bearers, he ordered the Ultramarines to hold position rather than risk the chapter's strength in a potentially futile rescue mission. When refugee ships from Cadia arrived carrying millions of survivors, he authorized their settlement on worlds that were already struggling to support their populations, knowing that resource conflicts were inevitable. "The needs of the many," he said simply when I questioned the logic of these decisions. Connor can be rebuilt if the sector survives. These refugees carry the spirit of Cadia in their hearts. That is worth more than any forged world. The Emperor's will is manifest in the survival of humanity, not in the preservation of any particular human achievement. This was the fundamental difference between the two empires, distilled into a moment of crisis. The Galactic Empire had been built around the assumption that its technological and organizational superiority made it indispensable. When that superiority was challenged, the entire system began to collapse. The Imperium, by contrast, had been built around the assumption that humanity itself was under constant threat from forces beyond its comprehension or control. Individual worlds, fleets, even entire Space Marine chapters could be lost without compromising the Empire's essential mission. But it was the arrival of Robert Guilliman that truly demonstrated the Imperium's capacity for adaptation and renewal. I had read the historical accounts of the Primarch's mortally wounded state following his battle with Fulgrim, and I had assumed that his resurrection was some kind of metaphorical return to active service. The reality was far more dramatic and unsettling. The Primarch was a giant among giants, standing nearly 3 meters tall even without his power armor. His physical presence was overwhelming, not just because of his size, but because of the barely contained energy that seemed to radiate from every cell of his transhuman physiology. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had helped create the Imperium and who understood its purpose at a level that no purely human mind could comprehend. "The Imperium is dying," he announced during his first address to the assembled defenders of Ultramar. "It has been dying for 10,000 years, choking on its own bureaucracy, strangled by its own paranoia, consumed by the very faith that keeps it alive. But death is not the end for something built as we have built it. Death is transformation, renewal, the clearing away of weakness to reveal the strength beneath." I watched him reorganize the Ultramarines chapter according to principles that would have been considered heretical just months earlier. The Codex Astartes, the sacred text that had governed Space Marine organization for 10 millennia, was set aside in favor of new tactical doctrines adapted to the realities of a galaxy split by the Great Rift. Traditional company structures were modified to incorporate Primaris Space Marines, warriors whose enhanced physiology surpassed even the legendary capabilities of their predecessors. But it wasn't just military organization that Guilliman reformed. He instituted changes to imperial governance that addressed systematic problems that had been plaguing the Imperium for centuries. Trade regulations were streamlined to encourage economic growth rather than simple resource extraction. Religious doctrine was clarified to reduce sectarian conflicts that had weakened imperial unity. Most dramatically, he authorized technological innovations that the Adeptus Mechanicus had been suppressing out of fear that they might lead to another Men of Iron rebellion. "Stagnation is not stability," the Primarch explained during one of our strategic conferences. "The old empire you served fell because it stopped growing, stopped adapting, stopped believing in its own vision of the future. We will not make that mistake. The Imperium will change or it will die, but it will not remain the same." Yet even as I witnessed these remarkable transformations, I realized that they were possible only because the Imperium's foundational structure was so robust. Guilliman could reorganize the Space Marines because their loyalty to the Emperor was absolute, and their faith in their Primarch was unshakable. He could reform imperial governance because the bureaucracy was designed to implement orders from higher authority without question. He could authorize technological innovation because the Adeptus Mechanicus worshipped the Omnissiah, and the Primarch spoke with the Omnissiah's voice. The contrast with the Galactic Empire's collapse was striking. When Emperor Palpatine died at Endor, the entire imperial system began to fragment almost immediately. Moff Gideon declared independence and established his own warlord state. Admiral Thrawn vanished into the unknown regions with much of the imperial fleet. The bureaucracy split into competing factions, each claiming to represent the Emperor's true heir. Within a year, the 1,000-year Reich had become a dozen squabbling successor states. But when the Emperor of mankind was interred upon the Golden Throne, the Imperium grew stronger. The Space Marine legions were reorganized into chapters to prevent another Horus heresy, but their fundamental mission remained unchanged. The imperial bureaucracy expanded to fill the administrative gap left by the emperor's incapacitation, but it continued to function according to his established principles. The imperial cult transformed the emperor from a distant ruler into an omnipresent god, making rebellion not just treasonous, but literally blasphemous. I spent months analyzing the institutional mechanisms that made this stability possible, and what I discovered was a system of governance unlike anything in recorded history. The Imperium wasn't just an empire, it was a hybrid of empire, theocracy, and something approaching a living organism. Its various components weren't just administrative divisions, they were specialized organs serving different functions within a larger body. The Adeptus Astartes served as the Imperium's immune system, responding rapidly to threats and containing them before they could spread. The Imperial Guard functioned as its circulatory system, moving resources and personnel to where they were needed most. The Adeptus Mechanicus acted as its digestive system, breaking down raw materials and transforming them into useful technologies. The Adeptus Ministorum operated as its nervous system, carrying messages and maintaining coordination across vast distances. Most crucially, the Emperor himself served as the brain of this vast organism, not actively directing its every function, but providing the essential consciousness that kept all the parts working together toward common goals. Even trapped upon the Golden Throne, his psychic presence permeated every aspect of Imperial life. Space Marines felt his guidance in battle. Imperial Guardsmen drew strength from his protection. Navigators followed his light through the warp. Ordinary citizens lived and died in the certainty that he watched over them. This organic unity was what had allowed the Imperium to survive catastrophes that would have destroyed any conventional empire. During the Age of Apostasy, when the mad High Lord Goge Vandaya nearly destroyed Imperial civilization through his megalomaniacal policies, the system's immune response activated automatically. Sebastian Thor led a popular uprising supported by the Space Marines, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and eventually even the Imperial Guard. Vandira was overthrown and executed, his corrupted bureaucracy was purged, and new safeguards were instituted to prevent similar crises in the future. The War of the Beast had demonstrated the Imperium's capacity for rapid adaptation under extreme pressure. When the largest orc Wa in history threatened to overwhelm Imperial defenses, the High Lords of Terra temporarily suspended normal protocols and authorized emergency measures that would have been unthinkable under ordinary circumstances. The Last Wall Protocol was activated, sacrificing the Imperial Fists chapter to buy time for a counterattack. New Space Marine chapters were founded in direct violation of the Codex Astartes. Even Xenos allies were accepted, despite millennia of Imperial doctrine declaring all alien life to be inherently hostile. These measures succeeded in defeating the beast's Wa, but more importantly, they demonstrated that the Imperium could bend without breaking. Once the crisis passed, normal protocols were restored, the emergency measures were rescinded, and the system returned to its baseline configuration. The Imperium had proven that it could adapt to meet any threat while maintaining its essential character and purpose. Now, facing the 13th Black Crusade and the opening of the Great Rift, the Imperium was demonstrating those same capabilities on an even grander scale. Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade wasn't just a military campaign, it was a massive reorganization effort designed to strengthen Imperial capabilities across multiple sectors simultaneously. Primaris Space Marines were being deployed to reinforce chapters that had suffered heavy losses. New Forge worlds were being established to replace those lost to Chaos incursions. Trade routes were being re-established to connect isolated Imperial territories, but perhaps most impressively, the Imperium was learning from its enemies. Chaos tactics that had proven effective were being studied and countered. Technological innovations discovered in Necron tomb worlds were being adapted for Imperial use. Even tyrannid bioorganisms were being analyzed to improve Imperial biotechnology. The Empire that had once been characterized as stagnant and hidebound was proving itself capable of remarkable innovation when circumstances demanded it. As I watched Imperial forces push back the tide of chaos and begin the long work of rebuilding what had been lost, I finally understood why the Imperium would outlast any rival. It wasn't because it was stronger or more efficient than other empires, though it was certainly both of those things. It was because it had been designed from the beginning to survive in a universe that was actively hostile to human existence. The Galactic Empire had assumed that the galaxy was fundamentally neutral, a collection of resources and populations that could be organized and controlled through superior technology and management. When that assumption proved false, when the galaxy demonstrated that it contained forces that couldn't be pacified or negotiated with, the Empire had no response except to apply more force and build bigger weapons. The Imperium had started with the opposite assumption, that the galaxy was full of enemies that wanted humanity dead, that survival required constant vigilance and sacrifice, and that the price of existence was eternal war. Every aspect of Imperial society had been shaped by this understanding, from the fanatical devotion of its citizens to the ruthless pragmatism of its leaders. This was why the Imperium would outlast the Galactic Empire or any other conceivable rival, not because it was better, but because it was built to endure. Chapter 5: The Price of Forever. But as I walked through the ruins of Cadia after the planet's destruction, picking my way through the rubble of cities that had stood for 10,000 years, I began to understand the true cost of that endurance. The Imperium might be built to last forever, but forever was a very long time to maintain an empire built on suffering and sacrifice. The smell of death hung over everything like a shroud. Millions of Imperial guardsmen had died in the final battles, their bodies buried beneath collapsed hive cities or vaporized by orbital bombardment. The famous purple flowers of Cadia, those hardy blooms that had somehow thrived in the planet's polluted soil, were now black and withered. Even the planet's broken moon hung in the sky like an omen of endings, its fragments slowly spiraling down to impact the surface in decades-long meteor showers. Yet the survivors still chanted their ancient battle cry, "Cadia stands!" They shouted it as they loaded onto evacuation transports. They carved it into the sides of refugee ships. They whispered it as last prayers over the graves of the fallen. The planet might be dead, but the idea of Cadia, the fortress world that had never fallen, the gate that had held back chaos for 10 millennia, that idea would live on in the hearts and minds of every human being who had heard the story. This was the Imperium's greatest strength and its most terrible burden. It could transform any defeat into a spiritual victory, any loss into a sacred memory, any death into a martyrdom that inspired others to greater sacrifices. The Galactic Empire had demanded loyalty based on success and prosperity. The Imperium demanded loyalty based on shared suffering and collective purpose. I met a young woman named Christine during the evacuation, a former White Shield who had been too young to serve in the final battles, but old enough to understand what she had lost. Her entire family had died in the defense of Casa Craf, her parents in the Guard, her brothers in the PDF, her sister in the orbital defense stations. She had nothing left except the uniform on her back and the laser gun in her hands. "Why do you keep fighting?" I asked her as we waited for transport to one of the evacuation ships. "Your world is gone, your family is dead, your regiment is scattered. What is there left to fight for?" She looked at me with the kind of expression reserved for someone who had asked a particularly stupid question. "For him," she said simply, pointing toward Terra, though the planet was thousands of light years away. "For all the worlds that haven't fallen yet. For all the people who are still alive because we held the line as long as we could." This was faith in its purest form. Not belief based on evidence or hope for reward, but absolute commitment to a cause larger than oneself. The Galactic Empire had never inspired this kind of devotion because it had never demanded this kind of sacrifice. Imperial citizens had been asked to obey, to contribute, to serve, but they had never been asked to die for something they would never live to see. Yet as I studied the Imperium's history more carefully, I began to see the costs of this system more clearly. The Index Astartes contained casualty records for Space Marine chapters going back thousands of years, and the numbers were staggering. Entire chapters had been lost to single campaigns, 1,000 of humanity's finest warriors wiped out in battles that were footnotes in the larger war against chaos. The Imperial Guard's losses were measured not in millions, but in billions. Entire generations of young men and women fed into the grinder of eternal war. The economic costs were equally devastating. Hive worlds stripped their environments bare to feed the Imperium's war machine. Forge worlds consumed entire star systems worth of raw materials to produce weapons that would be destroyed in battle within months of their creation. Agricultural worlds were pushed to their biological limits to feed populations that existed primarily to supply more soldiers for more wars. But perhaps the most disturbing cost was psychological. I spent time with the Adeptus Ministerum's records of Imperial saints, and what I found was a catalogue of human beings who had been driven to such extremes of faith and suffering that they had transcended normal human limitations. Saint Celestine had died and been resurrected multiple times, each death more agonizing than the last. Saint Sabbat had led crusades that consumed entire sectors in religious warfare. Saint Macarius had conquered more worlds than any general since the Great Crusade, and had died young from the stress of command. These were not healthy role models for a civilization to venerate. They were examples of what human beings could become when pushed beyond their natural limits by an ideology that valued devotion over happiness, duty over fulfillment, and sacrifice over survival. The Imperium had created a culture that glorified suffering and treated ordinary human contentment as a form of spiritual weakness. The contrast with the Galactic Empire was stark in this regard. For all its flaws, the Empire had tried to provide its citizens with prosperity, security, and at least the possibility of individual advancement. Imperial Academy graduates could look forward to successful careers, comfortable lives, and the respect of their peers. Even stormtroopers, the Empire's most indoctrinated soldiers, were well-fed, well-equipped, and reasonably assured of survival if they performed their duties competently. The Imperium offered no such assurances. Imperial Guard recruits could expect to die in their first battle, if they were lucky. Space Marine aspirants underwent trials that killed 90% of candidates before they even began the augmentation process. Even Imperial citizens who never served in the military lived under constant threat of being declared heretical for expressing the wrong opinion, reading the wrong book, or failing to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for the Emperor's glory. Yet somehow, this system had created the most stable and enduring empire in galactic history. The question was whether that stability was worth the price in human suffering. I discussed this paradox with Inquisitor Vex during one of our regular theological debates. She listened to my concerns with the patience of someone who had heard similar arguments before, her augmetic eye clicking as it focused on various details of my expression. "You judge the Imperium by the standards of your old empire," she said finally. "You assume that human happiness and individual fulfillment are the highest goods, that a society should be organized to maximize comfort and minimize suffering. But those assumptions rest on a fundamental error about the nature of reality." "What error?" I asked. "The error of believing that the universe is benign, or at least neutral. Your empire fell because it was built on the assumption that peace was the natural state of things, that conflict was an aberration that could be resolved through superior technology and organization. But the universe is not neutral. It is actively hostile to human existence. Chaos does not want to rule humanity. It wants to corrupt us, to turn us into playthings for beings that exist beyond our comprehension. The Tyranids do not want to negotiate with us. They want to consume us utterly, to leave nothing behind but empty worlds. The Necrons do not see us as rivals. They see us as vermin to be exterminated." She paused, her human eye meeting mine while her augmetic continued its mechanical scanning. "In such a universe, happiness is a luxury we cannot afford. Individual fulfillment is a distraction from the essential task of survival. The Imperium does not exist to make its citizens happy. It exists to keep them alive and human in the face of forces that would gladly see them dead or worse." This was the core philosophical difference between the two empires, and it explained why one had lasted 24 years while the other had endured for 10 millennia. The Galactic Empire had been built on optimistic assumptions about the nature of civilization and the possibility of lasting peace. The Imperium had been built on pessimistic assumptions about the nature of reality and the necessity of eternal vigilance. Both approaches had their merits and their costs. The Empire had provided its citizens with prosperity and opportunity, but had left them unprepared for the kind of existential threats that could destroy entire civilizations. The Imperium had prepared its citizens for the worst possible scenarios, but had created a society that treated suffering as a virtue and sacrifice as a duty. The question of which approach was better was ultimately unanswerable because it depended on assumptions about the fundamental nature of reality that could not be proven or disproven. If the galaxy was indeed full of existential threats to human survival, then the Imperium's sacrifices were not just justified, but necessary. If those threats were manageable through other means, then the Imperium's costs might be disproportionate to the benefits it provided. But from a purely practical standpoint, the comparison was clear. The Imperium had demonstrated its ability to survive and adapt to threats that would have destroyed any conventional empire. It had outlasted alien invasions, demon incursions, technological catastrophes, and internal rebellions that would have shattered any political system based on more optimistic assumptions about human nature and galactic politics. During my final visit to Terra, I was granted an audience with one of the Custodian Guard, the Emperor's personal protectors who had stood watch over the Golden Throne for 10,000 years. The warrior was ancient beyond reckoning, his augmented physiology having sustained him through centuries of service that would have killed any normal human being. "You seek to understand whether our path was justified," he said in a voice like grinding stone. "Whether the price we have paid was worth the survival we have achieved. But that question assumes that we had a choice, that there were alternatives available that would have achieved the same results with less suffering." He gestured toward the throne room, where the Emperor's desiccated form continued its eternal vigil against the forces of chaos. The Master of Mankind saw the future that awaited humanity if we continued on the path of ignorance and division. He saw the birth of She Who Thirsts, the rise of the ruinous powers, the coming of the star gods and the great devourer. He built the Imperium not because it was perfect, but because it was the only system that could ensure human survival through the long night that was coming. "And you believe that survival justifies any cost?" I asked. The custodian considered this for a long moment, his ancient eyes reflecting the flickering light of the throne's machinery. "Survival is not a cost," he said finally. "Survival is the baseline from which all other values derive their meaning. Without survival, there can be no happiness, no fulfillment, no progress, no hope. The Imperium may be a harsh master, but it is humanity's master. Under its protection, our species endures. Under its guidance, we remain human despite all the forces that would corrupt or destroy us." As I left the throne room for the final time, I realized that this was the ultimate answer to my question about whether the Galactic Empire could outlast the Imperium of Man. The Empire had been built for conquest and expansion, but it had no plan for what came after victory. The Imperium had been built for survival and endurance, with the understanding that victory was not a destination, but a process that would continue until the end of time itself. In that sense, the question was not whether the Galactic Empire could outlast the Imperium, but whether any empire built on different principles could hope to match its longevity. The answer, I had come to believe, was no. Chapter 6: Institutional Evolution. The true genius of the Imperium's design became clear to me during the War of Beasts, when I witnessed firsthand how its institutions adapted to threats that its founders could never have anticipated. Unlike the Galactic Empire, which had been designed as a static system optimized for specific conditions, the Imperium had evolved into something approaching a living organism, capable of responding to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. I was serving as a historical advisor to Lord Commander Solar Macarius during his campaigns in the Segmentum Pacificus when the first reports of the beast's wah reached us. The initial intelligence suggested a typical orc incursion. large, dangerous, but manageable through standard Imperial doctrine. What we encountered instead was an enemy that challenged every assumption about how galactic warfare should be conducted. The Orcs had somehow organized themselves into a confederation spanning multiple star systems. They had developed technology that rivaled or exceeded Imperial capabilities in several key areas. Most disturbing of all, they had demonstrated strategic thinking and long-term planning that contradicted everything we thought we knew about Orc psychology and behavior patterns. "This is impossible," General Sir Janus muttered as he studied the tactical displays showing Orc fleet movements across the sector. "Orcs don't coordinate on this scale. They don't build siege engines this sophisticated. They certainly don't conduct strategic deception operations." But the evidence was undeniable. The beast's forces had lured Imperial fleets into carefully prepared ambushes, had constructed fortified positions that withstood orbital bombardment, and had even managed to infiltrate agents into Imperial installations to gather intelligence and conduct sabotage operations. These weren't the savage raiders that Imperial doctrine was designed to counter. They were a peer competitor that could match Imperial capabilities in most areas and exceeded them in some. The Imperial response demonstrated the flexibility that the Galactic Empire had lacked. Rather than doubling down on existing tactics and technologies, Imperial Command immediately began adapting to the new threat. The Adeptus Mechanicus was authorized to reverse engineer captured Orc technology, despite theological concerns about the purity of machine spirits. The Space Marines were reorganized into larger formations to match the scale of Orc operations, even though this violated established interpretations of the Codex Astartes. Most dramatically, Imperial forces began coordinating with Xenos allies, accepting assistance from Eldar craftworlds that shared an interest in preventing Orc dominance. This adaptability was possible because the Imperium's institutional structure was designed to prioritize the Emperor's ultimate goals over any specific methods for achieving them. Where the Galactic Empire had been constrained by its reliance on technological superiority and centralized command, the Imperium could modify its approach as circumstances required, while maintaining its fundamental commitment to human survival and dominance. The theological foundation of this flexibility was explained to me by Cardinal Astral Benedictus during a planning session for the assault on Ulanor. "The Emperor's will is manifest in results, not in methods," he said. "If working with Xenos advances the cause of humanity, then such cooperation is blessed. If adopting enemy technology strengthens our defenses, then such adoption is sacred. The letter of the law serves the spirit of the law, not the reverse." This was a profound philosophical difference from the Galactic Empire's approach to governance and military strategy. The Empire had been built around specific technological and organizational advantages, and when those advantages were neutralized or overcome, the entire system began to fail. The Imperium, by contrast, was built around a mission that transcended any particular set of tools or methods. I witnessed this principle in action during the Siege of Goro, where Imperial forces found themselves facing Orc fortifications that could not be breached through conventional assault. Rather than accepting defeat or requesting reinforcement, the local Space Marine captain authorized the use of experimental weapons that had been declared too dangerous for general deployment. The weapons worked, the fortress fell, and thousands of Imperial lives were saved. But the captain was subsequently censured by the Inquisition for violating safety protocols. "The Emperor's work was accomplished," the Inquisitor explained when I questioned the apparent contradiction. "But discipline must be maintained. We cannot allow every local commander to ignore established procedures simply because they believe their situation is exceptional. The balance between flexibility and control must be carefully managed, or we risk losing the institutional coherence that makes adaptation possible." This tension between adaptation and stability was perhaps the Imperium's greatest strength. Individual commanders could respond creatively to local conditions, but they did so within a framework of shared values and common purpose that prevented the kind of fragmentation that had destroyed the Galactic Empire after Endor. The system could bend without breaking because its foundation was strong enough to support innovation while maintaining unity. The contrast became even more apparent when I studied the Imperial response to the Horus Heresy, the greatest crisis in the Imperium's history. When fully half of the Space Marine legions turned traitor and marched on Terra itself, the system did not collapse into competing warlord states as the Galactic Empire had done. Instead, it adapted by dividing the remaining loyal legions into smaller chapters, implementing new safeguards against future rebellions, and strengthening the institutions that had proven most resistant to corruption. The Codex Astartes itself was an example of this adaptive response. Rather than simply reconstructing the pre-heresy system or abandoning the Space Marine concept entirely, Guilliman had created a new organizational structure that maintained the military effectiveness of the legions while reducing their political threat. The chapters were large enough to operate independently, but small enough that no single leader could threaten imperial stability. They were given autonomy in tactical matters, but bound by shared doctrine and common loyalty to the Emperor. Similarly, the expansion of the Adeptus Custodes and the creation of the Inquisition represented institutional innovations designed to address specific weaknesses that the heresy had revealed. The Custodes provided a loyal force that could never be corrupted because their loyalty was hardwired into their genetic structure. The Inquisition created a watchdog organization that could monitor other imperial institutions for signs of corruption or heresy, while remaining accountable only to the Emperor himself. These reforms had been implemented gradually over centuries, tested and refined through practical experience, and eventually codified into the institutional structure that I observed during my service. The Imperium I knew was not the same organization that had existed during the Great Crusade, but it was recognizably descended from it and committed to the same fundamental goals. The Galactic Empire had never developed this capacity for institutional evolution. Palpatine's system was designed to funnel all authority and decision-making through the Emperor himself, with subordinate institutions serving primarily as instruments for implementing his will. When he died, there was no mechanism for adapting the system to new circumstances or transferring authority to new leadership. The result was immediate fragmentation and eventual collapse, but the Imperium's evolutionary capacity came with its own costs and limitations. The process of institutional adaptation was slow, sometimes taking centuries to implement changes that might be urgently needed. The theological framework that enabled flexibility also constrained it, requiring all innovations to be justified in terms of existing doctrine. Most importantly, the system's survival instincts sometimes led to excessive conservatism, rejecting useful innovations out of fear that they might lead to corruption or heresy. I saw this during the debates over accepting Tau diplomatic overtures during the Damocles Crusade. The Tau Empire represented a potential ally against chaos and tyrannid threats, but imperial doctrine regarding Xenos made any formal alliance politically impossible. The result was a series of unnecessary conflicts that weakened both empires and benefited only their common enemies. The price of purity, Inquisitor Cryptman explained, when I questioned this policy. We cannot afford to compromise our principles even when doing so might provide short-term advantages. The moment we begin accepting Xenos allies as equals, we start down a path that leads to the kind of multi-species confederation that destroyed the pre-imperial human polities. Better to fight alone and remain human than to survive through compromise and lose our essential nature. This absolutist thinking was both the Imperium's greatest strength and its most significant weakness. It provided the ideological coherence that enabled institutional adaptation while preventing the kind of mission drift that had weakened other empires. But it also created blind spots and rigidities that sometimes prevented optimal responses to complex challenges. Yet despite these limitations, the Imperium's track record of survival and adaptation was unmatched in galactic history. It had outlasted alien empires, weathered technological catastrophes, survived internal rebellions, and adapted to threats that its founders could never have imagined. Each crisis had made it stronger, each challenge had refined its capabilities, each victory had validated its essential approach to governance and warfare. During my final analysis of imperial institutional structure, I identified 7 key factors that distinguished it from the Galactic Empire and explained its superior longevity. First, theological foundation. that provided meaning and motivation beyond material incentives. Second, distributed authority that prevented single points of failure while maintaining overall coordination. Third, institutional redundancy that ensured essential functions would continue even if specific organizations were destroyed. Fourth, adaptive doctrine that could evolve to meet new challenges while preserving core principles. Fifth, selective recruitment that ensured leadership positions were filled by individuals committed to the system's values. Sixth, cultural integration that made resistance to imperial authority a form of blasphemy rather than simple political opposition. Seventh, long-term perspective that prioritized survival over efficiency and endurance over immediate success. These factors had created an empire that was not necessarily more powerful than its rivals, but was certainly more durable. The Imperium might not always win, but it was nearly impossible to destroy completely. And in a galaxy full of existential threats to human survival, that durability was worth any price. Chapter 7. The Long Game. As I stood in the ruins of Monarchia, 38,000 years after its destruction by the Ultramarines, I finally understood the true scope of the Imperium's victory over time itself. The city had been reduced to radioactive glass during the Great Crusade, its word-bearers builders censured for treating the Emperor as a god rather than a man. Now, 10 millennia later, the entire galaxy worshipped that same Emperor as the divine master of mankind, and Monarchia's destruction was remembered as a tragic mistake rather than necessary correction. The irony was not lost on me. Lorgar's vision had ultimately triumphed over his father's intentions, but in a way that served the Imperium's long-term stability rather than undermining it. The Emperor's transformation from secular leader to religious icon had provided exactly the kind of unifying mythology that the Galactic Empire had lacked, where Palpatine had demanded obedience based on fear and political calculation. The God Emperor commanded devotion based on faith and spiritual commitment. This transformation illustrated the Imperium's most remarkable characteristic: its ability to turn even its failures into sources of strength. The Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne, which should have been the Empire's death knell, had instead become the foundation of its greatest period of expansion and consolidation. The Horus Heresy, which had nearly destroyed Imperial civilization, had ultimately strengthened it by eliminating weak elements and refining its institutions. Even the current crisis caused by the Great Rift was already generating innovations and adaptations that would make the Imperium more resilient than ever. I had spent the last several years traveling the galaxy, visiting worlds that had been part of both empires, studying the long-term effects of different approaches to governance and social organization. What I found was a pattern of gradual but inexorable imperial victory, not through military conquest, but through cultural and institutional persistence. On Naboo, where Queen Amidala had once defied the Trade Federation and sparked the events that led to Palpatine's rise, I found a world that had been imperial for so long that its inhabitants genuinely believed they had always served the God Emperor. The beautiful cities and pastoral landscapes remained, but the democratic traditions and cultural independence that had characterized the planet during the Republic era had been completely erased. Children learned Imperial High Gothic as their primary language, with the local dialect relegated to ceremonial occasions. The planet's artistic traditions had been redirected toward glorifying the Emperor's majesty, rather than celebrating human creativity and individual expression. Yet the inhabitants were not oppressed or miserable. They took genuine pride in their world's contributions to the Imperial war effort, from the skilled pilots it supplied to the guard regiments, to the beautiful devotional art produced in its monastery workshops. The transformation had taken millennia, but it was complete and irreversible. Naboo was now as imperial as Terra itself, its people as devoted to the Emperor's cause as any shrine world pilgrim. This pattern was repeated across thousands of worlds that had once been part of the Galactic Empire. The Imperial system had not conquered these planets through force of arms. It had absorbed them through patient cultural integration and institutional replacement. Local traditions were preserved when they could be adapted to imperial purposes, and eliminated when they conflicted with Imperial doctrine. Native populations were not enslaved or exterminated. They were converted, transformed into Imperial citizens who genuinely believed in the righteousness of their new allegiance. The process was slow but inexorable, like geological transformation on a galactic scale. Each generation was slightly more imperial than the last, until eventually the transformation was complete and irreversible. By contrast, the Galactic Empire's approach to cultural integration had been superficial and temporary. Local traditions were suppressed but not replaced. Native populations were controlled but not converted. When imperial control was removed, the old ways quickly reasserted themselves. I witnessed this difference during my visit to Alderaan, or rather to the memorial shrine that had been built in the system where Alderaan had once existed. The Death Star's destruction of the planet had been intended as a demonstration of imperial power that would cow other worlds into submission. Instead, it had created a powerful symbol of imperial tyranny that inspired resistance throughout the galaxy. The Galactic Empire had achieved a tactical victory that became a strategic defeat, demonstrating its fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually worked. The Imperium would never have made such a mistake. When Imperial forces destroyed rebellious worlds, and they had destroyed thousands over the millennia, they did so as part of carefully planned campaigns designed to achieve specific political and psychological effects. Exterminatus was not a demonstration of power, but a surgical tool applied when a world's corruption threatened to spread to other systems. The destruction was always presented as a necessary sacrifice to protect the greater Imperium, and the populations of nearby worlds typically responded with increased loyalty rather than resistance. This difference in approach reflected the two empires' fundamentally different understandings of human psychology and political dynamics. The Galactic Empire had assumed that fear alone could maintain order, that technological superiority could substitute for popular support, and that resistance could be overcome through the application of sufficient force. These assumptions had proven fatally flawed when tested against the kind of ideological commitment that the Rebel Alliance represented. The Imperium, by contrast, had built its system on the understanding that lasting power required genuine belief, that technological superiority was meaningless without spiritual commitment, and that resistance could be overcome only by offering something more compelling than what the rebels promised. The Imperial cult provided that alternative, not just political loyalty, but spiritual salvation, not just material prosperity, but eternal purpose. During my travels, I met countless individuals whose families had served the Imperium for dozens of generations, each one more devoted than the last. They were not victims of brainwashing or political oppression. They were genuine believers who had found meaning and purpose in service to something greater than themselves. Their devotion was not forced, but freely given, which made it infinitely more durable than any compliance based on fear or material incentives. The theological sophistication of the imperial system had also proven superior to the Galactic Empire's secular approach, where Palpatine had offered only order and prosperity in exchange for obedience. The God Emperor offered redemption and eternal significance. Imperial citizens could endure any hardship, accept any sacrifice, if they believed it served the Emperor's divine plan for humanity's salvation. This spiritual dimension gave the Imperium access to sources of power that the Galactic Empire had never tapped. Faith could motivate actions that rational calculation would reject. Prayer could provide comfort in circumstances where material solutions were unavailable. Martyrdom could transform defeat into victory by inspiring others to greater devotion. The Emperor's saints provided role models that ordinary citizens could aspire to emulate, while the promise of service beyond death gave even the humblest imperial servant a stake in eternity itself. But perhaps the most important advantage of the imperial system was its integration of human and post-human elements. The Galactic Empire had been purely human in its structure and leadership, which made it vulnerable to the limitations and weaknesses of baseline human biology and psychology. The Imperium incorporated Space Marines, whose enhanced physiology allowed them to serve for centuries without aging or weakening. It included navigators, whose genetic mutations enabled faster-than-light travel. It even accepted sanctioned psykers, whose psychic abilities provided capabilities that no amount of technology could replicate. This integration of different human subspecies created a more robust and adaptable civilization than either empire had managed independently. The Adeptus Astartes provided military capabilities beyond anything the Imperial Navy had ever fielded. The navigator houses enabled reliable interstellar communication and transportation across distances that had challenged even the Republic. The Adeptus Astronomica allowed Imperial forces to coordinate their actions across the entire galaxy in ways that the Galactic Empire had never managed despite its technological superiority. Most importantly, these post-human elements were fully integrated into the Imperial system, rather than existing as separate or competing power centers. Space Marines owed their loyalty to the Emperor, not to their primarchs. Navigators served the Imperium, not their own houses. Psykers were bound by ritual and training to use their abilities in service of Imperial goals. The system had learned from the Horus Heresy how dangerous it could be when post-human leaders pursued their own agendas, and had implemented safeguards to prevent such conflicts in the future. During my final analysis of the two empires' comparative longevity, I identified the fundamental philosophical difference that explained their different fates. The Galactic Empire had been built on the assumption that conflict was an aberration that could be eliminated through superior organization and technology. It sought to create a galaxy where war was unnecessary because resistance was impossible. This goal was both unrealistic and ultimately self-defeating, because it ignored the reality that conflict and struggle were essential components of human nature and social development. The Imperium had been built on the opposite assumption. That conflict was the natural state of existence, that struggle was essential for growth and development, and that peace was at best a temporary respite between battles. It did not seek to eliminate conflict, but to channel it in directions that served humanity's long-term interests. This approach was more realistic and more sustainable, because it worked with human nature rather than against it. This philosophical difference explained why the Galactic Empire had collapsed so quickly when its foundational assumptions were challenged, while the Imperium had grown stronger through 10 millennia of constant warfare. The Empire had been designed for a galaxy that did not exist. The Imperium had been designed for the galaxy as it actually was. As I prepared my final report on the comparative durability of these two galactic civilizations, I realized that the question was not whether the Galactic Empire could outlast the Imperium of Man, but whether any empire built on different principles could hope to match its longevity. The answer, based on everything I had observed and studied, was almost certainly no. The Imperium had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. It had created a form of government that was not just stable, but actively strengthened by the challenges it faced. Every enemy defeated, every crisis weathered, every sacrifice accepted had made it more resilient and more capable. It was not just an empire, but an evolutionary process, constantly adapting and improving while maintaining its essential character and purpose. In a galaxy full of existential threats to human survival, this was exactly the kind of civilization that humanity needed. It might not be the most pleasant place to live, but it was the most likely to ensure that humanity would still exist 10,000 years in the future. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Chapter 7. The Long Game. Standing once more in the shadow of the Golden Throne, 50 years after my first audience with the God Emperor, I finally understood the true meaning of the question I had been asked to investigate. It was not whether the Galactic Empire could outlast the Imperium of Man. It was whether any mortal empire could aspire to the kind of permanence that the Imperium had achieved. The answer, written in the bones of 1 billion worlds and the blood of countless generations, was a resounding no. The Emperor's withered form had not changed in all the decades I had spent studying his realm. The same cables and life support systems maintained his physical existence. The same psychic emanations filled the throne room with barely contained power. The same sense of overwhelming presence made even breathing an act of conscious will. But my understanding of what I was witnessing had been completely transformed. This was not just a man upon a throne. even a posthuman man of incredible power and vision. This was the living embodiment of humanity's will to survive, the crystallized essence of 10 million years of human evolution and struggle, distilled into a single consciousness that transcended the normal limitations of biology and mortality. The Emperor was not merely the ruler of the Imperium, he was the Imperium, its essential nature made manifest in flesh and bone and burning spirit. "You have travelled far in your studies," Inquisitor Vex observed as we stood in the prescribed place before the throne. "What conclusions have you reached about the durability of empires?" I chose my words carefully, knowing that my answer would be scrutinized not just by her, but by the countless servants of the throne who monitored every word spoken in this sacred space. "The Galactic Empire was built to conquer," I said. "The Imperium was built to endure. Conquest is a finite process with a beginning and an end. Endurance is an infinite process that continues as long as the will to survive remains strong." "And what creates that will?" she prompted. "Faith," I replied without hesitation. "Not just belief in victory or success, but faith in the righteousness of the cause itself. The Galactic Empire demanded loyalty to an institution. The Imperium inspires devotion to an ideal. Institutions can be destroyed or corrupted, but ideals are eternal." As I spoke these words, I thought of all the evidence I had accumulated over decades of research and observation. The Galactic Empire had lasted 24 years from its founding to its destruction at Endor. Its successor states had fragmented and collapsed within another generation, leaving only archaeological remnants and historical curiosities. The Imperium of Man had endured for over 10,000 years and showed no signs of decline. Indeed, it seemed to grow stronger with each passing century. But the comparison was not really between two empires separated by time and space. It was between two completely different approaches to the fundamental questions of governance, survival, and human purpose. The Galactic Empire had represented the pinnacle of secular technological civilization, efficient, prosperous, and rationally organized. The Imperium represented something far more primal and powerful, the transformation of survival instinct into religious devotion, of political loyalty into spiritual commitment, of temporal authority into eternal truth. During my years of study, I had identified 12 key factors that explained the Imperium's unprecedented longevity. First, theological foundation. The imperial cult provided meaning and motivation that transcended material concerns. Citizens did not serve the Imperium for personal benefit, but for the salvation of humanity itself. This made rebellion not just treasonous, but blasphemous, while sacrifice became not just duty, but privilege. Second, distributed authority. Unlike the Galactic Empire's centralized command structure, the Imperium divided power among multiple institutions that could function independently if necessary. The loss of any single component, even Terra itself, would not destroy the system as a whole. Third, institutional redundancy. Every essential function was performed by multiple organizations using different methods. If the Adeptus Mechanicus failed, the Space Marines could maintain some technological capabilities. If the Imperial Guard was defeated, the Space Marines could continue fighting. If the Space Marines were corrupted, the Inquisition could purge and replace them. Fourth, adaptive doctrine. Imperial institutions could modify their methods while preserving their fundamental purpose. The Codex Astartes could be reinterpreted for new conditions. The Imperial cult could incorporate local traditions. The Adeptus Mechanicus could develop new technologies within theological constraints. Fifth, selective recruitment. Leadership positions were filled through rigorous testing that ensured both competence and loyalty. Space Marine aspirants underwent trials that killed most candidates. Inquisitors were trained from childhood in faith and duty. Imperial governors were chosen for their devotion as much as their administrative skills. Sixth, cultural integration. Conquered populations were not merely controlled, but converted, transformed into genuine imperial citizens through patient cultural and educational work spanning generations. Local traditions were preserved when possible and eliminated when necessary. Seventh, Post-human elements. The inclusion of enhanced humans like space marines and navigators provided capabilities beyond those of baseline humanity while maintaining loyalty through institutional structure and religious indoctrination. Eighth, technological restraint. The Imperium's suspicious attitude toward innovation prevented the kind of technological disruption that had contributed to previous civilizational collapses. Stability was prioritized over efficiency, reliability over performance. Ninth, economic sustainability. Imperial resource extraction was balanced by genuine investment in infrastructure and population growth. Worlds were not simply stripped bare, but developed as long-term assets. 10th, strategic patience. Imperial planning operated on timescales measured in centuries or millennia. Short-term setbacks were accepted if they served long-term goals. Immediate efficiency was sacrificed for ultimate durability. 11th, ideological coherence. All imperial institutions shared the same fundamental beliefs about human nature, divine authority, and the essential struggle for survival. This prevented the kind of internal contradictions that had weakened other empires. 12th, transcendent purpose. The Imperium existed not just to serve humanity's immediate needs, but to prepare for humanity's ultimate destiny. Citizens could endure any hardship if they believed it served the Emperor's eternal plan. These factors had created something unprecedented in galactic history, a form of government that was not just stable, but actually strengthened by the challenges it faced. Each crisis refined Imperial capabilities. Each enemy eliminated, strengthened Imperial resolve. Each sacrifice offered enhanced Imperial legitimacy. The Galactic Empire had possessed some of these factors, but not others. It had achieved impressive technological capabilities and military efficiency, but lacked the ideological coherence and transcendent purpose that made long-term stability possible. When its foundational assumptions were challenged by the Rebel Alliance's ideological alternative, the entire system collapsed with startling rapidity. But perhaps the most important difference was the two empires' relationship to time itself. The Galactic Empire had been built for the present, designed to achieve immediate goals through available means. Its leaders thought in terms of years or decades. Its institutions were optimized for current conditions, and its planning horizon rarely extended beyond a single generation. The Imperium had been built for eternity, designed to survive any conceivable threat through any conceivable time span. Its leaders thought in terms of centuries or millennia. Its institutions were designed to adapt to changing conditions while preserving essential functions, and its planning horizon encompassed the ultimate fate of humanity as a species. This temporal perspective explained why the Imperium could accept short-term costs that would have been politically impossible for the Galactic Empire. Imperial citizens endured hardships that would have sparked revolution in any purely secular state, because they believed those hardships served purposes that extended far beyond their individual lifespans. The suffering of one generation was justified by the survival of all future generations. During my final days on Terra, I was granted one last audience with the figure who had become the center of my decade-long investigation. Cardinal Astral Benedictus had aged visibly in the years since our first meeting, his augmetic replacements now more extensive than his original biology. But his faith burned as brightly as ever, perhaps more brightly, as if proximity to death had intensified his connection to the eternal. "You have studied our empire and found it wanting in comfort," he said, his mechanical voice carrying notes of amusement. "You compare our harsh methods to your old empire's gentle efficiency and wonder whether the price of survival is worth paying." "I have studied both empires and found them suited to different purposes," I corrected. "The Galactic Empire was designed to create prosperity and order. The Imperium was designed to ensure survival and continuity. Both achieved their goals, but only one chose goals that could be sustained indefinitely." He nodded slowly, his augmetic eye focusing on details I could not perceive. "The question you were asked to investigate was whether the Galactic Empire could outlast the Imperium of Man. But the real question was whether any empire built on different principles could hope to match our durability. What is your conclusion?" I considered my answer carefully, weighing everything I had learned against everything I had believed when I first set foot on an Imperial Star Destroyer all those decades ago. The Galactic Empire represented the highest achievement of secular civilization, I said finally. It was efficient, prosperous, and capable of remarkable accomplishments. But it was built on the assumption that the galaxy was fundamentally benign, that conflict was an aberration, and that peace could be achieved through superior technology and organization. And the Imperium? The Imperium was built on the opposite assumption, that the galaxy is fundamentally hostile, that conflict is the natural state of existence, and that survival requires constant vigilance and sacrifice. These assumptions may be less optimistic, but they are more realistic. And realism, in the long run, is more durable than optimism. Cardinal Benedictus smiled, an expression made unsettling by the mechanical components of his face. Then you understand why we endure while others fall. We do not fight for victory, we fight for survival. We do not seek peace, we seek strength. We do not promise happiness, we offer purpose. And purpose, Captain Kyrell, is the one thing that neither time nor enemies can destroy. As I prepared to leave Terra for the final time, I realized that my investigation had answered far more than the question I had originally been asked. I had discovered not just why the Imperium would outlast any conceivable rival, but why it deserved to. In a galaxy full of threats to human existence, in a universe where survival itself was a daily struggle against forces beyond human comprehension, the Imperium of Man had created something precious beyond measure, the institutional means for humanity to endure until the end of time itself. The Galactic Empire could never have achieved such permanence because it had been built for a galaxy that did not exist. The Imperium had achieved it because it had been built for the galaxy as it actually was, hostile, dangerous, and utterly indifferent to human desires for peace and prosperity. In choosing survival over comfort, duty over happiness, and eternity over immediacy, the Imperium had made the one choice that mattered, to ensure that humanity would still exist when the last star burned out and the final darkness fell. Everything else, all the suffering, all the sacrifice, all the terrible cost of 10,000 years of war, was just the price of that ultimate victory. And it was a price worth paying, because the alternative was not just defeat, but extinction itself. The Emperor protects, now and forever, world without end. In his name, the Imperium endures. The months following my final audience with Cardinal Benedictus brought revelations that would reshape my understanding of the Imperium's true nature. As the Indomitus Crusade pushed deeper into the Dark Imperium, I found myself assigned to document the liberation of worlds that had been cut off from Imperial control for over a century. What I discovered challenged every assumption I had made about the relationship between central authority and local resilience. The world of Vigilus had been under siege by Orc forces for 3 standard years when we arrived with the relief fleet. The planet's hive cities were scarred by constant bombardment, its industrial sectors reduced to smoking ruins, and its population decimated by warfare and starvation. By any rational assessment, Vigilus should have fallen long ago. Yet as our dropships descended through the war-torn atmosphere, we received clear Vox transmissions from the planetary governor requesting landing coordinates and offering tactical support. Governor Lucinda von Castellan met us at the spaceport, her dress uniform immaculate despite the crater-scarred landscape around us. She was a woman of perhaps 60 standard years, her augmetic left arm bearing the scars of recent combat, her eyes burning with the kind of fanatic devotion that I had learned to recognize as the hallmark of true Imperial servants. "Welcome to Vigilus, Captain Kyrell," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the distant rumble of artillery. "The Emperor has finally sent us the reinforcement we have prayed for. We have held the line as he commanded, and we will continue to hold it until the last Orc is driven from our sacred soil." As she spoke, I realized something that struck me like a physical blow. This woman genuinely believed that our arrival was not a rescue, but a reinforcement. In her mind, she had not been cut off and abandoned. She had been given a mission to defend this world, and she had carried out that mission with absolute faith that help would eventually arrive. The siege had not weakened her resolve, it had strengthened it. During the next several weeks, as Imperial Guard regiments fought to break the Orc siege lines, I conducted interviews with dozens of Vigilus defenders. What I found was a population that had been transformed by suffering into something approaching the mythical saints of Imperial legend. Civilians spoke of divine visions that had guided them to hidden food caches during the worst famines. PDF troopers described miraculous victories where their faith had literally turned aside Orc bullets. Even the planet's servitors seemed to function with unusual efficiency, as if the machine god had blessed their simple mechanical minds with additional purpose. "The Emperor tests those he loves most," explained Sister Superior Amalia of the Order of Our Martyred Lady, as we watched her battle sisters conduct evening prayers in a bombed-out cathedral. "Vigilus has been tested for 3 years, and we have not been found wanting. Every death has been an offering, every victory a sacrament, every moment of suffering a prayer that rises to the golden throne." This was the Imperium's secret weapon, I realized. Not its space marines, or its battleships, or its industrial might, but its ability to transform suffering into strength, defeat into determination, loss into devotion. The Galactic Empire had demanded loyalty based on success and prosperity. When those things were threatened, loyalty evaporated. The Imperium demanded loyalty based on shared sacrifice and common purpose. When those things were tested, loyalty deepened into something approaching obsession. I witnessed this principle in action during the final assault on the Orc stronghold of Scorpec Crater. The Imperial Guard's 42nd Cadian Shock Regiment had been reduced to less than half strength during weeks of brutal urban combat, yet they advanced on the Orc positions with the mechanical precision of men who had transcended normal human limitations. Their colonel, a grizzled veteran named Mordak Kars, led from the front despite injuries that should have hospitalized him for months. "Why do you keep fighting?" I asked him as we sheltered in a ruined hab block, waiting for the artillery barrage to lift. His left leg was clearly broken, his right arm hung useless from shrapnel wounds, and his face was a mask of dried blood and determination. He looked at me with the kind of expression reserved for someone who had asked why water was wet or why the sky was black. "Because the Emperor commands it," he said simply. "Because Cadia stands, even when Cadia falls. Because someone has to hold the line, and we are the ones who were chosen for this honor. Chosen. Not ordered, not assigned, not condemned. Chosen." This single word encapsulated everything that made the Imperium different from every other empire in galactic history. Its citizens did not serve because they had to. They served because they had been selected for the privilege of service. They did not fight because they were forced to. They fought because they had been granted the honor of fighting. They did not die because they were expendable. They died because their sacrifice had meaning in the Emperor's grand design. This psychological transformation was what made the Imperium truly eternal. Physical infrastructure could be destroyed and rebuilt. Military forces could be defeated and replaced. Political institutions could be corrupted and reformed. But faith, once properly instilled, was nearly indestructible. It could survive any defeat, endure any hardship, outlast any enemy. The liberation of Vigilus took another 2 months of savage fighting, but when it was complete, the planet was stronger than it had been before the siege began. The Orc attack had eliminated the weak and incompetent elements of the population while strengthening the resolve of the survivors. The industrial damage would be repaired within a decade, but the spiritual strengthening would last for generations. During the victory celebration, I found myself standing beside Governor von Castellan as she addressed the assembled defenders. Her words were carefully chosen, each phrase crafted to reinforce the lessons of the siege while preparing her people for future challenges. "We have proven that Vigilus is worthy of the Emperor's trust," she proclaimed. "We have shown that no enemy can break the faith of true Imperial citizens. But this victory is not an end. It is a beginning. The galaxy is full of threats to humanity, and we must remain vigilant, remain strong, remain ready to serve wherever the Emperor calls us." The crowd's response was thunderous, but what struck me most was its quality. This was not the desperate relief of people who had barely survived a terrible ordeal. This was the confident roar of warriors who had proven themselves in battle and were eager for their next chance to serve. The siege had not broken them. It had forged them into better instruments of the Emperor's will. This pattern repeated itself across dozens of worlds liberated during the Indomitus Crusade. Each planet that had been cut off from Imperial support had developed its own unique adaptations to local conditions, but all had maintained their essential Imperial character. Some had evolved new forms of religious observance adapted to their specific circumstances. Others had developed innovative military tactics or technological solutions to resource shortages. A few had even incorporated elements from local Xenos cultures, carefully sanitized and blessed according to Imperial doctrine. Yet despite this diversity of local adaptation, all remained recognizably part of the same galactic civilization. The Imperial cult provided a common language of symbols and rituals that transcended planetary differences. The authority of the Adeptus Terra was recognized even by populations that had not seen an Imperial official for generations. The loyalty to the God Emperor remained absolute, even among people who had never seen Terra or the Golden Throne. This unity in diversity was perhaps the Imperium's greatest achievement. Where the Galactic Empire had imposed cultural uniformity through bureaucratic mandate and technological standardization, the Imperium achieved cultural coherence through shared faith and common purpose. Local traditions were preserved and even encouraged, as long as they served the greater goal of human survival and Imperial glory. I documented this phenomenon most clearly on the world of Mordant, where isolation during the Great Rift had led to the development of unique burial customs that incorporated both traditional Imperial prayers and local shamanic practices. The result was a form of ancestor worship that strengthened rather than weakened the population's devotion to the Emperor, as the honored dead were seen as intermediaries between the living and the divine. The Emperor speaks to us through many voices, explained Mordant's Cardinal Exarch during a ceremony honoring the planet's war dead. Through the ecclesiarchy, through our battle brothers of the Adeptus Astartes, through the blessed machines of the Omnissiah, and through the wisdom of those who have gone before us. All serve his will, all carry his light, all strengthen the bonds that hold humanity together across the darkness of space. This theological flexibility was another crucial factor in the Imperium's longevity. Where the Galactic Empire's secular ideology had been rigid and brittle, breaking when challenged by alternative viewpoints, the Imperial cult was organic and adaptive, capable of incorporating new elements while maintaining its essential character. Heresy was defined not by deviation from specific practices, but by rejection of fundamental principles. As long as local customs supported human unity and Imperial authority, they were not just tolerated, but celebrated as expressions of the Emperor's infinite wisdom. The contrast with the Galactic Empire's approach to cultural diversity could not have been clearer. During my years of service aboard Imperial Star Destroyers, I had witnessed the systematic suppression of local traditions across dozens of worlds. Art forms were banned because they did not conform to Imperial aesthetic standards. Religious practices were criminalized because they competed with secular authority. Languages were replaced because they hindered administrative efficiency. The result was a galaxy of sullen, resentful populations who complied with Imperial directives but felt no genuine loyalty to Imperial ideals. When the Empire fell, these suppressed cultures reasserted themselves with explosive force. Worlds that had been model Imperial citizens for decades immediately reverted to pre-conquest traditions and governmental forms. The Empire's cultural uniformity had been revealed as superficial conformity, maintained only through force, and dissolved the moment that force was removed. But the Imperium's approach had produced the opposite result. Worlds that had been Imperial for millennia remained Imperial even when cut off from central authority for generations. Their local adaptations strengthened rather than weakened their connection to the greater Imperial project. Their unique contributions enriched rather than threatened the common culture. Their diversity served unity rather than undermining it. This was visible even in the Imperium's military organization. Where the Galactic Empire's forces had been standardized according to rigid templates, Imperial military units reflected the character and capabilities of their homeworlds while maintaining interoperability with forces from other regions. Catachan jungle fighters brought skills adapted to their Death World environment. Vostroyan Firstborn reflected their planet's martial traditions and technological expertise. Talan Desert Raiders embodied their world's nomadic heritage and expertise in mobile warfare. Yet all served the same cause, followed the same tactical doctrines, and responded to the same command authority. Their diversity was an asset rather than a liability, providing the Imperial military with capabilities that no single standardized force could match. More importantly, it gave each regiment a distinct identity and proud heritage that strengthened rather than weakened their commitment to Imperial service. During the final phases of the Vigilus campaign, I witnessed this principle in action as regiments from 6 different worlds coordinated a complex assault on the primary Orc stronghold. Each unit contributed its unique strengths: Catachan stealth and jungle warfare expertise, Cadian discipline and combined arms tactics, Vostroyan technical skills, and heavy weapons proficiency, while maintaining perfect coordination through shared doctrine and common purpose. The assault succeeded brilliantly, but what impressed me most was the aftermath. Rather than competing for glory or claiming exclusive credit for the victory, the different regiments immediately began sharing tactical innovations and technical improvements. The Catachans taught the Cadians new methods for urban concealment. The Vostroyans showed the Talon new maintenance techniques for their heavy equipment. The victory belonged to all because the cause served by all transcended the particular contributions of any individual unit. This spirit of cooperation in diversity extended beyond military operations to every aspect of Imperial society. The Adeptus Mechanicus incorporated technological innovations from across the galaxy while maintaining theological unity through common worship of the Omnissiah. The Ecclesiarchy adapted its practices to local conditions while preserving doctrinal coherence through shared devotion to the God Emperor. Even the Inquisition, that most rigid and paranoid of imperial institutions, showed remarkable flexibility in its methods while maintaining absolute consistency in its purpose. As my investigation drew to its final phase, I realized that I had been asking the wrong question from the beginning. The issue was not whether the Galactic Empire could outlast the Imperium of Man, but whether any empire built on different principles could hope to achieve the kind of organic unity that made genuine permanence possible. The answer was self-evident. Unity imposed through force was temporary and fragile. Unity achieved through faith was enduring and resilient. The Galactic Empire had relied on the former. The Imperium had achieved the latter. That difference explained everything else: the duration, the adaptability, the capacity for renewal, the ability to transform challenges into opportunities for growth and strengthening. Standing once again in the shadow of the Golden Throne as the Indomitus Crusade reached its triumphant conclusion, I finally understood what I was witnessing. This was not just an empire that had learned how to survive. It was an empire that had learned how to evolve, to grow stronger through adversity, to transform even its defeats into victories for the human spirit. The God Emperor's vision was not static but dynamic, not a fixed destination, but an ongoing journey toward humanity's ultimate destiny among the stars. Each generation of Imperial citizens added their own contributions to this grand project, while maintaining fidelity to its essential purpose. Each world brought its own gifts while serving the common cause. Each victory advanced the whole while honoring the particular. This was why the Imperium would outlast not just the Galactic Empire, but any conceivable rival. It had achieved something that transcended mere political organization or military power. It had become the institutional embodiment of humanity's will to survive and thrive in a hostile universe. As long as human beings existed, as long as they faced threats that required collective response, as long as they needed hope and purpose to sustain them through hardship, the Imperium would endure. The Emperor protects, now and always. The Imperium endures, world without end. In his name, we are eternal. I write these final words as the 13th Black Crusade reaches its climax and the galaxy burns with the light of a billion wars. The Great Rift tears reality itself apart, Demon armies march on sacred Terra, and the Imperium faces its greatest test since the Horus heresy. Yet I have no doubt about the outcome. The Galactic Empire would have fallen by now, its rigid institutions shattered by the scale of the crisis, its secular leadership unable to inspire the kind of sacrifice necessary for survival. But the Imperium was built for this moment, shaped by 10,000 years of preparing for the ultimate test of human endurance. The God Emperor stirs upon his golden throne. Primarchs return from death and exile. New heroes rise while ancient evils fall. The wheel of history turns, but its center holds, anchored by faith deeper than space and stronger than time. Could the Galactic Empire outlast the Imperium of Man? The question answers itself. One was built for conquest, the other for eternity. One served the ambitions of mortals, the other the will of God. One measured success in years, the other in millennia. In the end, there is only one empire that matters, the one that will still stand when the universe itself grows old and dies. The Emperor protects, the Imperium endures forever.